Welcome everybody.
Hello, Prof.
Hello, Prof.
Does the soul have an immortal consciousness, or is the consciousness that has an immortal soul? Or are both just neural connections in the brain that are destructible after death? Neuroscience has widely demonstrated that our thoughts, emotions, and perceptions are the result of the electrical and chemical activity of billions of interconnected neurons in our brain. So, what are consciousness and soul? According to these studies, consciousness emerges from these complex interactions between these billions of neurons forming the neural networks. These neurons are the basic cells of the brain that communicate with each other via synapses, and form thought, consciousness, and intelligence. The prefrontal and parietal cortexes, as well as the thalamus, play essential roles in the generation of consciousness. It emerges when information is broadcast through a global workspace in the brain, allowing different regions to process the information and share it in a coherent way. But then, what is the soul? According to the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, the soul is an eternal and immaterial entity that leaves the body after death without disappearing, which therefore survives after death. It is often perceived as the essential part of the human being, responsible for his personality and morality, and its destiny is heaven for the good doer or hell for the evil doer, based on the actions of the individual during his earthly life. The soul, according to Hinduism, is eternal and immutable. It is seen as a part of Brahman, which is described as the ultimate infinite, omnipresent, omnipotent, incorporeal, transcendent and immanent reality, the divine basis of all existence. The soul undergoes a series of reincarnations on earth based on karma, totality of the individual's past actions, the ultimate goal of which is its liberation from the cycle of death reincarnation, to reach moksha, final death, which brings the soul to a state of bliss and complete serenity that Buddhism calls nirvana, after several passages on earth of the individual's soul which end with an exemplary life of goodness.
Despite what Prof. Arson has just said, consciousness is a concept that remains difficult to define, encompassing both the subjective perception of the world, personal identity, and the capacity to feel. If we associate the consciousness of an individual with his soul, the object of our religious beliefs and not of science, it becomes complicated. John Locke, an English philosopher of the 17th century, was interested in the questions of personal identity, consciousness and knowledge, and its limits. He distinguished simple ideas, obtained by the senses, from complex ideas, formed by the mind. He profoundly marked the philosophy of the mind by proposing an original conception of personal identity. Contrary to the Cartesian vision of an immutable I and a substance endowed with thought, he considers that the identity of a person resides in the continuity of his consciousness in his memory. For him, what makes a person the same over time is the consciousness that he has of himself and his past experiences. This consciousness is like a common thread that connects our successive mental states. Memory therefore plays a crucial role in this construction of identity. By remembering our past experiences, we recognize ourselves as being the same person who lived them. Locke clearly distinguishes the identity of a person from the substance that composes it. According to him, the corporeal substance can change over time, but the personal identity remains as long as the consciousness remains the same. Biology later showed that indeed the cells of the body are almost all renewed after 7 years, except the cells of the brain.
If consciousness is linked to the soul, what happens when consciousness is turned off? What happens to the soul when we sleep, dream, or are unconscious? What happens during general anesthesia or when we are in a coma? Is the immaterial soul sensitive to material anesthetics? To the blows of a boxer? Or is only the substance of the body, with its billions of destructible cells, sensitive? So what happens to the soul and personal identity during these intervals of time of unconsciousness? What happens to consciousness and personal identity after death? After the decomposition of the memory elements, that are the neurons of the brain? If the soul is immaterial, how can it have consciousness after death without necessary material elements? If someone bangs his head against the wall and loses consciousness, is the soul, which is supposed to be non-material, affected by physics as a material element? Why then, when the brain dies, the soul should remain conscious and alive after death? Consciousness being the result of neuronal electrical and chemical activities in the form of reflections or thoughts, if these activities are not written or recorded on a physical material support of memorization, it does not emerge and disappears. Then if consciousness dies with its material support, which is the brain, where does the consciousness of the soul come from to be alive after death? Similarly, we know that material chemicals act on consciousness, alcohol, drugs, sleeping pills, anesthetics, etc. If the soul is immaterial, linked to consciousness, which is linked to material things, is it sensitive to these same products? For example, is the soul sensitive to DMT, dimethyltryptamine, a powerful psychedelic drug that affects all the senses, altering a person's thinking, perception of time and emotions, causing hallucinations, seeing or hearing things that do not exist or are distorted? If consciousness is altered and dies, how can the soul be immortal? Also, when someone loses their mind and becomes insane, if they die in this state, will the spirit of their soul be healthy?
A computer is at the same time hardware and software. Software is functionalities in the form of classical or intelligent algorithms. Can these algorithmic functionalities be considered as consciousness or soul? When the computer is on, it is like an awakened individual. If you touch its keyboard or its touch screen, it reacts as if it has senses. But if it is off, it does not react because the RAM, its working memory, is empty. It is as if it is anesthetized, and its consciousness is off. It only reacts through its start key, which transfers functionality from its hard disk to its working memory. When a computer rusts or is destroyed, its software disappears and dies with it if it is not stored on a material medium. The body and brain of a human being are much more complex than a computer, even if the latter is much faster. In light of neuroscience and analogies with computer artificial intelligence, can science have a definitive opinion on the existence or non-existence of the soul? No, the only thing we can say today is that the soul is not a subject of study of science for the moment. Consciousness and intelligence, yes.
These questions induced by scientific progress and the evolution of human thought open the way to many discussions and debates on the nature of the human being, the relationship between the mind and the body. With the progress of medical neuroscience, organ transplants, and implantations of digital chips in the brain, the question of consciousness, personal identity, and that of the soul also arise. If the body of a person receives the brain of another person, or his digital clone, does it retain its own identity? Does it retain its own soul? What happens to life after death as described by religions in this case? How will the soul find its body and its consciousness in the afterlife if organs have been replaced before death? How is this possible, knowing that biology has demonstrated that the atoms of a body pass into another body, human, animal, or plant, in the form of food or mineral salts after decomposition in the cycle of life?
If the soul can be interpreted as the genetic code, does not the notion of immortality correspond to the transmission of the genes of life through reproduction and preservation of the species? The idea of assimilating the soul to the genetic code is attractive, which opens new perspectives on the nature of the soul and immortality. Let us examine some avenues of reflection. DNA, the carrier of genetic information, is a physical, tangible molecule, present in each cell of our body, which is transmitted from generation to generation. Everyone has a genetic code, inherited from parents with some mutations. This code is unique, with the exception of identical twins. This uniqueness recalls the singularity of each soul. If we accept the idea that the soul is linked to the genetic code, the question of immortality takes on a new dimension. Its individual immortality, as it is often conceived in religions, becomes a possible form of collective immortality linked to the transmission of genes.
Of course, this interpretation of the soul and immortality raises many questions. Doesn't equating the soul with the genetic code risk reducing the richness of psychic and spiritual life to a simple biological mechanism? DNA explains the transmission of genetic information, but it says nothing about consciousness, subjectivity, emotions, and individual experiences that constitute the richness of the human soul. If our soul is determined by our genes, what space is left for free will? The idea of a soul as a genetic code is an attractive metaphor that invites us to rethink the notions of identity, immortality, and transmission. It opens a dialogue between science and spirituality, between biology and philosophy. However, the nature of the soul and immortality remains a mystery to all human beings. It continues and will continue to fascinate and divide minds for a long time. These are existential questions that have crossed my mind, with the advancement in age, that I share with those who like to think. These questions deserve to be examined, even if it is difficult to answer them. And I think that each of us will find personal answers, which can satisfy his mind, his beliefs or his spirituality, without them necessarily being the absolute truth.
Thanks for watching this video until the end, and see you soon in another topic.